Recording in progress.
Relativity. All right. Okay. What's happening? Okay, now I know what's going on. All right, I'm sorry. So anyway, as an existential philosopher, the whole relativity thing is very important for me because the idea of it, I don't want to lose the notion that in one sense, all ethics and all morality is relative. But also, I don't want to lose the possibility of being able to say there are some things that maybe we shouldn't do that always most people would find unethical, or there's a problem or something like that. So part of the issue of looking at the whole relativism thing is to get to a place where we can see what the challenge relativism has for ethics, right? Now then, one of the last things that I was asked about by Arwen the other day, is that Arwen, is that right, or did I have that wrong? Anwar, I'm so sorry. Anwar asked me the other day about the Back the Blue thing. And so I actually found an article that's pretty reasonable that I thought some of y'all might want. It's in the notes here about what the difference is between defund the police, which is put the money that used to go to social work and counseling, but was defunded from social work and counseling, and then the money was just put into the police department. Police aren't trained to be social workers. They're not trained to be counselors. They're not trained to do any of that stuff. So defund the police is primarily about taking money away from the police for the things that they do they're not trained to do, and then giving that money to the people who are trained to do it, right? That's why there's a difference between defund the police and completely abolish the police, all right? So anyways, this is a really pretty good article in that regard. Also, despite how politicians and talking heads have vilified critical theory over the last year, it's basically a collection of methods to evaluate sociocultural structures in our daily lives. And this is a good link to get an overview of critical theory that actually will tell you what critical theory is rather than what the people saying critical theory is. Okay. All right. So just as kind of reminders, part of what we're doing here by going over the challenges to ethics is assessing our own ethical climate. And remember, the ethical climate are the enveloping conditions of sociocultural exchange, right? And that includes all the ideas that we take for granted. Now, one of the places that critical theory becomes the great beast of people who are okay with how everything is structured is that critical theory allows you to go into the ethical climate and take a seriously long critical look at the stuff that we take for granted and never question. Okay. And then the moral environment is how we live out our existence by our convictions, right? And one of the things that I guess we'll get to today, and hopefully we'll begin to have more discussions and not me narrating everything, is the idea that the moral inside of a particular ethical climate, like say the United States of America, there are all of these different moral environments that are overlapping and on top of each other, right? So you're kind of walking and going through, not only carrying through your own moral environment wherever you go, but you're walking through other moral environments that either are influenced by other people or they require you to, as we would say, code switch in order to get through them so that you don't get in trouble or you don't do the wrong thing, right? So our challenge and focus today is relativism. There is no one truth. There are only the different truths of different communities. Okay. All right. How many people in here have ever had someone say to you, well, that's just your opinion? How often have you heard that? Right? Did you notice here Blackburn points out that's a horrible way to respond to anybody that you're trying to have a discussion with, right? Well, that's just your opinion. First of all, on the one hand, it sounds like they're saying, oh, well, you have your opinion, I have mine. But actually what they're saying is that's an opinion, whereas I know something. It's implied in how shady it is when it's said, right? So we'll get to that a little bit farther on. But one of the things that's really important about the whole notion of relativism, and that we have to kind of keep in mind, is when in 1492, so 501 years ago, 520, was it? No, 530 years ago, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? What this meant, this was the beginning of European colonialism. Were the Romans colonialists? Yes. Were the Greeks colonizers? Yes. Were the Egyptians colonizers? Yes. Were the Hebrews colonizers? Yes. Were the Chinese colonizers? Yes. Yes, there have been other kinds of colonizing people who send out colonies, right? Little cultures, subcultures of their own culture to take over some area that appears to be not being utilized by somebody, right? Or to take over an area that used to be utilized by people, but now they're not using it anymore, right? So there's that kind of stuff's always been around. That's one of the ways that human beings do things. But there's something particularly successful about European colonialism compared to the colonialisms of these other cultures, right? That is not because Europeans are so much better than all these other cultures that had colonies. It's that at the time that Europe was accomplishing its colonialism, beginning in 1492, there were a number of factors that had come into play that had never existed before. One was guns, right? It's a really good book, but it's got a lot of problems. If you're actually a really careful historian, there are a lot of problems with this text, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Anybody ever read it? Here, you read it? It's a good book. It has a lot of interesting comments to make, but it kind of misses a few points. But it's a great way to kind of get into the notion that between guns, germs being taken to places the germs had never existed, right? So when Europeans got to the United States of America, well, excuse me, why did I say that? When Europeans got, look at me being an Americanist, when Europeans got to what we now call the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, they carried with them germs that had never existed here. And so it had a remarkably debilitary effect on all of the different native people who lived in this part of the world, right? They were not ready for these germs. That's one reason that the Americas were a little easier to conquer, but at the same time, or to colonize. At the same time, interestingly enough, it's quite possible that about 100 years before Europeans set foot in the Americas, at least this group of Europeans, we could make arguments about the, Vikings or whatever. But about 1350 to 1400, it's quite possible there was a massive, massive plague that affected the Western Hemisphere. And what that plague did was decimated all of the cultures in the Western Hemisphere to a certain extent. So when the Europeans showed up, especially on the east coast of what's now the United States of America, they were like, it's almost as though you could just throw a seed out and a whole field of things will start multiplying, right? You don't even have to prepare the land, it's so fertile. No, it's actually the case that more than likely in that huge plague that happened before the Europeans showed up, it lowered the number of natives who were living here. And in the process, it meant that all of the preparation they'd done to the land was just waiting for somebody to pick it up and do it, right? So in that kind of way, it's kind of like in the old days when people would show up in an area that looked like it might have once been inhabited and they decide, well, let's colonize this place. Nobody's here anymore, right? All right, so on the one hand, you had the germs before the Europeans got there. You also have the germs after they show up, smallpox, even flu, right? Okay, and then the other, of course, is steel. Steel is to be separated from guns for the simple reason that steel can be utilized for more than just making bullets. So, and also bullets are made of lead for a long time. Okay, so you get this kind of thing. So you're like, okay, Maggie, get to the point. We've been going off and on this whole European colonizing thing for a minute. What's that all about? What's this have to do with relativism? One of the things that happened in European colonialism is they took Christianity and their own burgeoning understanding of natural philosophy, which we now today call science, and they utilized these as an aspect of this is why the way we live is right and the way that all of you live is wrong, and you have to live the way that we live. Mm-hmm.
Was so with
Mm-hmm.
and so it's been forcing that I could
Right. Right. This is the difference between what you're describing. Yeah, what you're describing is multiculturalism, and what the Europeans were practicing in their original colonial treatments going out into the world was monoculturalism. Right? There is only one culture that matters. All other cultures have to be subsumed and submitted. Now that the Romans obviously were in charge, they're not going to say we don't, all of us are equal, but they weren't. They also had this ability to do what the British actually, the British Empire, learned the lessons finally after World War II, and they began to practice what's called multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is what you're describing. That is, yes, there is a leading, dominating group of people, right? But we have enough room inside the laws of all human beings to allow for y'all to have your culture, so long as you just pay your taxes and do the shit that we ask you to do. That's all you got to do, right? But this European colonialism that begins in 1492, and this is very important for people who want to study racism and want to study how racism, European and American racism actually evolves out of anti-Semitism. The same thing in 1492, we sent Columbus off to look for something, the Spanish did, but also in Spain, they defeated and cast out the Muslims who'd been in charge of southern Spain, and then they decided to get rid of the Jews. And what had happened is around 1400, so around the time that the Western Hemisphere was being hit with this plague that sort of decimated most of the populations over here, over in Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, what's now today Spain and Portugal, in the Iberian Peninsula, they developed a new way of thinking about Muslims and Jews, not as human beings of a different religion, but as literally different kinds of people. Well, it does to a certain point. Yes, this is very true. But again, when you look at that, the Jewish notion of the goyim and even the Muslim notion of the non-believer, if you look at what it says, it's all kind of operating under the notion of Noah's laws. So the goyim, all people live under Noah's laws. Only Jews live under the Mosaic laws. So they make that distinction, but they're not saying they're a whole other kind of species of person. They're saying they're different from us because they're under a different law. What the Spanish and the Portuguese were saying is these are not the same kind of human being as us. That's very different, right? You see? Yeah. This is actually where so actually all of the racism that you know in America, that you've ever heard about, that you've ever read about, maybe that you've experienced, all begins in one sense in Spain, with the Spanish deciding and the Portuguese deciding that instead of thinking of these as human beings who have a different religious tradition, these are simply other kinds of people. They are other than us, right? Utterly other than us, right? And then what else happens around this time? The same Spanish monarchy marries their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, to Henry VIII. And guess what the British start doing? Treating the Irish as other kinds of human beings, as not the same kind of human beings as British people, as English people. It all starts around this same time, right? It's like the group you want to subjugate and control, you treat as either not fully human or a completely different species from you, right? Do you see how this sort of thing is a completely relativistic claim, right? It's a totally relativistic claim. It says we as Spaniards and good Catholics are fully human. Jews and Muslims aren't. And Jews especially have to be watched out for. So that whole anti-Semitism thing comes to a whole new level, right? That's where you finally begin what we would call anti-Semitism. Anti-Irish sentiment gets out of the English into the Irish. They also begin maybe pointing these things at the Scottish, but mostly at the Irish. And you end up in this kind of monocultural bit of claims. Now, the reason I've gone into this kind of long thing about colonialism is to say that in colonialism, a la this European colonial way, it's the idea is our way of doing things is right. Other people need forcing into those ways, right? In all of Roman history, they had two groups of people that they treated as needing to be subjugated because they just won't go along with us. That was the Carthaginians, and they raised Carthage. And that was the Jews, and they raised Jerusalem. And outside of that, the Romans never forced their way of life on anybody. And the major idea with the Carthaginians and the Jews was simply, you people are not doing what we're asking of you, and you're causing all these problems, and so therefore we're going to throw force on your ass, right? But when you get to this European colonialism, which is going to first colonize the Western Hemisphere, then colonize Africa and parts of Asia, the idea is this: our way of doing things is the right way, and we're going to force you at gunpoint and sword point to kiss the cross and do things the way we do them. Okay? Now, one of the things that comes from having a kind of relativistic way of looking at the world, right, or a relative ethic, is that you understand a more pluralistic and relaxed appreciation of human diversity is often a welcome antidote to an embarrassing imperialism, what Blackburn says, right? In the United States, there's been, in the ethical climate of America, there's been this thing going on since before I was born, so a long time, right? In which I remember as a little kid, the first time I heard someone, I can remember it was my dad's cousin, Bobby, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table and him haranguing my father for an hour almost on why all the Mexicans and everybody from everywhere else needs to learn English and just adapt to the way that we do things and fuck their culture and all the rest of that. I remember that. It was 1972, right? The very first time I ever heard somebody say we have to force them to do things the way that we do. Or else what kind of society do we have? So this becomes an actual real issue. Can you have an ethical climate of pluralism, or does your ethical climate have to be monocultural, right? So monoculturalism would be, maybe we might say, singularism. And multiculturalism would be pluralism, right? But this is already, all this stuff's already been has already been discovered a long time ago. And one of the places that we see it is in father of history, Herodotus. Okay, and he says, if one were to order all of mankind to choose the best set of rules in the world, each group would, after due consideration, choose its own customs. Each group regards its own as being by far the best. Custom is king of all. Right? Now, this is really important because we understand that customs are things that human beings develop. Right? Customs are things that human beings create. All right. If you can understand that, fully formed from nature, and it doesn't appear fully formed from God, but it's a human custom. If you can understand that, you can begin to free yourself up a little bit from this kind of monocultural singularism or imperialism ruling over, having, the idea that your culture, your cultural customs should rule over all cultural customs, right? All right. And now we get to one of my mottos. I think this is probably, of all the aphorisms I've written, this is probably the one that I utilize the most when I teach. I know I utilized it in the intro classes. It's necessary that humans have customs. However, no particular custom is itself necessary. Right? If you just stop and think about it, all culture is customs. Right? So when I say that all human beings are arranged inside of cultures, right? And arranged inside of the when and the where that they arise, the when and the where that they live, the societies that they build together. Okay. And the only way for human beings to get along with each other is through customs. If we could know each other's hearts and know each other's minds, we might not need customs. But as it is, language only gets you so far in knowing what the hell's going on. So we have to develop different customs to help us communicate, help us do things, right? So by custom, y'all come in here, sit down, shut up, and listen as long as I'm talking. Or at least pretend to listen as long as I'm talking. Right? That's a custom. Yes, it's a standard, it's a rule, it's a thing that we do, but it's a custom, and it's actually an ethical custom, because if everybody were in here talking at the same time, we're not going in a similar direction, right? But at the same time, I don't want to singularly impose on everybody my viewpoint, right? I'm giving you my viewpoint, and I'm welcome to challenge it or tweak it or poke it or stick it with swords if you need to, right? Because if I haven't said this, I really want to get this across. I am not trying to persuade you of shit. I am not here to persuade you of anything. I'm here to describe some things, to lay out how some people think about stuff, and share with you how I think about stuff. But I'm not trying to persuade you. Right? This isn't a debate class. It's not a rhetoric class. It's not about persuading you to a new viewpoint. It's simply about opening you up to thinking about these things maybe a little differently. Right? So it's necessary that we have customs, but no particular custom is absolutely necessary. And you remember, if you read the Blackburn, you'll remember that in Herodotus tells about a time when the Persian Emperor Darius brought in some Greek people, and he asked them, how much would I have to pay you? Or if I gave you like 1,000,000 drachma or 1,000,000 gold pieces, would you eat your mother and father when they die? Eat their corpse? And they're like, good God, no. Right? But then he brings in some people from part of the Indian aspect of the Persian Empire. And then this is actually this is a subset of the Indian religion, where to honor their parents, they eat them when they die. And he asked them, if I gave you 1,000,000 gold pieces, would you not honor your mom and dad by eating them when they die? And of course, they did the exact same thing the Greeks did. Oh, no. It's our custom. It has to be done this way or we don't honor them. So the real issue here is, notice, it's necessary that humans have customs like honor the dead. But what that looks like, there's no particular way that looks. Right? Have you ever noticed, I don't know if you've really paid attention, but Jewish and Muslim people, when they die, they don't get treated the same way as most people do in America. The rest of America is Protestants and Christians and atheists and Catholics often do, right? They don't get embalmed, right? But for us, we do it. Why do we embalm our dead? Well, actually, it's interesting. The embalming process within 50 years turns the body into goo. So it's not actually a preservation. It only preserves them so they can lay out for an extra week or so. It doesn't actually preserve the body like mummification would, right? And then on top of that, I mean, really think about that. Why would you embalm a body? Anwar?
Not his full name, but Vladimir Lenin.
Mm-hmm.
How do they,
Okay, what they did with him was a partial embalming process and a partial mummification process, and then a lot of plastic and wax to make it look like it never degraded. Yeah. They actually learned from some of the monasteries in Russia and throughout Europe where they've done that with saints, how to keep the body from. First thing you got to do is get rid of all the guts and anything that's liquid, right? Pack it with salt, blah, 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 blah. But the point really is here, the only reason that we embalm bodies, what do you think? It's for the living. So, yeah, okay. And then there's some kind of thing that happened along about 100 or so years ago, or maybe more, 120 years ago, where they're like, for health reasons, we should embalm bodies, right? That turned into a huge part of the industry of burying people, right? I've talked to you about the prison industrial complex, and I've mentioned the military industrial complex. And I've talked also about how this might be the instructional industrial complex. There's also the death industrial complex, funerals, right? It's been turned into a for-profit industry. And so it's very interesting because the laws are pretty strict, when my brother died, my mom was shattered because my brother was very poor, so we had to cremate him. However, you can't by law touch a body that has not been embalmed unless you're in the process of embalming the body, right? So here's the deal. They brought us into a room, they opened a curtain, they showed us my dead brother and told my mother that she couldn't kiss him or hold him or touch him because he'd not been embalmed. And I don't think she really ever got over that. The next time she saw my brother, he was just a bunch of ashes. Right? She never really recovered from that, not being able to say that last goodbye. So in one sense, there's this ability to do that, but then there's this other weird thing. And then you got to ask yourself, well, what do they do with Jewish and Muslim bodies? Because I know they don't not let people touch them. So this didn't make any sense to me. Right? Anyway, again, we get into this thing where ethics and morality are maybe telling us we should preserve the body carefully because we should honor the dead. But then this gets picked up in our ethical climate as a way of making money. And then it turns into something totally else, totally otherwise, right? I think that's an important aspect of this notion of relativity when you stop to think about it. But can goodwill derive from ways of acting that change with the culture, right? So part of the issue that you get with relativism is, well, if everything stays in this kind of relativistic aspect, don't you finally reach a point where you can't, where the relativism eats itself in a sense, right? Where if you literally buy into it's all relative, then people who sleep with their 10-year-old children, that's fine. incest between a brother and sister is okay, right? If this is part of the problem, the challenge that relativism has to ethics, right? It's like if you adopt a relativistic ethic and you go full on crazily relativistic, just doubling down on everything, it's like everything is permitted because it's all relative, right? But that actually goes against my motto, and it goes against the argument that Blackburn's trying to portray here, right? If my motto is it's necessary that are for people of criticisms of ethical behaviors that harm people, right? Any kind of harm, especially those harms that are dehumanizing harms, right? So we can say that it's usually not a question of imposing any, operating with the oppressed and supporting their emancipation. In other words, I understand that in parts of Africa, there are long-standing traditions of circumcising women, female circumcision, right? Can we be critical of that, not being from one of those cultures? What we would want to say, I think, I agree with Blackburn, is, yeah, you can be critical of that because this is what's, whatever the purpose of this is, it mostly seems to be to just dehumanize and control, and harm, not to elevate. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the same thing. It's like when men are circumcised because of the law of Moses or because of the Quran, what it does is it basically lowers a man's ability to have pleasure. Someone with the penis's ability to have pleasure if it's circumcised. Again, in our society, the majority of people in the United States, men born in the United States, biological males born in the United States, are circumcised. Why? Not because they're Jewish, not because they're Muslim. Yeah, exactly. So circumcision is primarily performed for health reasons, but the health reason is to keep boys from masturbating. So as children, right? So in that sense, there are two things imposed on people unwillingly. Like a decision is made for a child. Again, they don't get to make a decision. It's made for them, right? But now what is it that makes female circumcision worse than male circumcision? While male circumcision is the forming of the penis, and it takes away a lot of the extra pleasure at the end of the penis, it doesn't utterly take out the clitoris of a woman. It's not the same thing. The female circumcision, depending on what region you're in, can be from clipping to almost completely excising the clitoris, to sewing the woman's vagina shut, except for a small hole, and a whole bunch of other things. So when you start to kind of take these things into consideration, you see, well, yes, male circumcision is wrong because it's done to a child. Female circumcision is very wrong because it seems to be a way of just simply attempting to control women for no other reason than they're women, right? So in relativity, I can say both of these are children being forced into something they have no way of agreeing to. Okay, that already starts both of them off this path. But then there's a cascading effect of it gets worse and worse once you realize that it's not, that the mutilation can become quite severe, right? To the point that most of the women who have it and will do it because that's tradition suffer their whole lives because of it, right? Now, and so this issue then that relativism doesn't mean you have no ability to offer a critique when you see dehumanizing or harmful behaviors, right? Is to elevate the voices of those who are often silenced by the powerful actors in the culture, since very often those on the bottom don't get to say anything, right? The overwhelming majority of people that I've ever heard defend female circumcision are men from those cultures. Sometimes women, surrounded by a lot of older men telling them to say what they're supposed to say, right? So that's a problem. That's problematic, right? In this society, let's get to some relativism. Samantha, you'll know the answer because I asked this question last semester. Let's see. What's your name in the back? Your name back there. Yeah. What's your name? Brandon? You want to answer a question? Is it okay if I ask you a question? Just out of left field. What's the youngest age that in Texas law that a girl could get married to her man? 17? Okay, that's what it is now. What do you think the youngest age was? Like 120 years ago. Okay. It was 8. 140 years ago, it was 8, then it was 10, then it was 12, then they got right with Jesus, I guess, and raised it to 18. Why would you allow girls to get married at 8 or 10? It's still 10 in Delaware, by the way. Huh? There wasn't enough women. What else? Fertility? Really, 8-year-olds? I didn't know 8-year-olds were fertile. I know you're not. I'm just
as women age, they biologically a minimum number of eggs, whereas men
an infinite amount, but they have a much larger amount of sperm that's active up to a certain age. Yes. But does that old maid? We say that here too. We used to say girls were old maids if they hadn't been married by the time they were 16. Then they were old maids if they hadn't been married by the time they were 18. But that's, that's all progressive compared to, well, if she's 13, she still doesn't have a husband. Yeah. What's your name? Bella. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How many people in here believe that a 14-year-old can give consent to sex? So there's actually a big thing going around on TikTok right now, the deconstructing Christianity TikToks that actually point out the fact that Mary, when Gabriel appeared to her and said, "Aren't you lucky? God's going to make you pregnant," was 14 years old. I mean, if you think, right? So it's about power. It's about power, reproductive power, and all that, right? So what about in our society right now? If you have sex, does that mean, if this is for the ladies in the room, for all those who can actually have a baby? If you have sex with someone, are you consenting to having a baby just because you had sex? It's a possible outcome. It's not a necessary outcome, right? So there's also these issues, kind of these interesting issues of consent, what we call consent problem. This means we feel together. That's what consent means, is to sense it together, to make sense together, to put it together and make sense of it. So we share the same sense, right? So when you get into a situation where you consent to erotic exchange, right? This is not consent to keep going if one of the partners decides to back out of it. It's not a binding contract. Consent is not the same thing as contract, right? If you're in the middle of having some sort of an erotic encounter with somebody, having intercourse with somebody, and you decide you're done with it and don't want to do it anymore, you have every right to get out of it, right? So you have consent to an erotic exchange, which has limitations. Quit when you want. Right? And pregnancy is not consented to just because you consented to an erotic exchange. Right? Now, obviously, in any kind of an issue where you're dealing with people who are sterile, there would be no baby anyway. And when you're dealing with, right, a masculine, a feminine, non-binary, where there's no ability to have a baby, it's not an issue. So this actually only becomes an issue biologically when the erotic exchange accidentally results in a pregnancy, right? So I'm putting this forward because there are some people who want to impose onto women the idea that every time you have sex, you're consenting to getting pregnant. And that's part of their argument for keeping women from being able to do with their bodies what they want to do with their bodies, including to have an abortion. Right? Why, Bella? Why do we have laws like this and arguments like this? Yeah, it's for the powerful again, right? It's all power. Ethics is actually the challenge to power. For the simple reason, ethics has to be a challenge to power. It can't just be mindless reinvention, mindless doing, right? And just copying and following the rules and all the rest of that kind of crap. Ethics, as a philosophical endeavor, is the attempt to discover what we ought to do from the conditions that we find ourselves in. And that often means challenging the power narratives, right? Part of the power narratives in our society that kind of keep things disproportionately in the hands of mostly masculine people is that there is an infantilizing of anyone that is not masculine, anyone who's not male. Anybody who's not male is automatically infantilized. Women are automatically turned into children who can't have any decisions on their part. It's the men in their life can decide for them because they're children. Right? That's an aspect of this. You can go farther too. If you are poor, let's put here, right? The ones being infantilized. If you're poor or not rich, you also are a child. Right? That's the reason you got to take piss tests if you get a little bit of welfare. It's the reason why they have to be all over your ass about what you can and can't buy with SNAP benefits. Because poor people are basically just children. They don't have any self-control. That's why there's so many of them. I don't believe that. That's part of the power dynamic argument. Right? So if you're masculine, you're not masculine, you have a kind of feminineness, you're infantilized. If you're not rich, you're poor, you're infantilized. If you're not white, but non-white, you are infantilized. If you are not a natural born citizen, I'll just put am here, but a alien, you are infantilized. Everybody who doesn't fit a certain kind of power description is basically turned into a child, and children don't have the right to make decisions for themselves. Right? Children don't make decisions for themselves. Okay? And what you'll get a lot of times, now we come back to something I mentioned earlier. What you'll get a lot of times when, and this can be actually women, non-binary, and queer people, even if they have a penis, right? Obviously, queer people are just a bunch of children because all they want to do is fucking get high and party and play. So we have to push them in their own little ghettos. Stay there. Don't come out of your ghetto. Stay in your little playpen, right? It's the same kind of thing, right? So when you come to this infantilizing issue and you're someone who is working, who's a laborer, and you begin to have a debate with someone who's got money and property and wealth, you'll often get, that's just your opinion, right? Or when you point out, as Bella has, that Mary was 14 years old, how could she consent to anything? That's just your opinion, right? You get that. That kind of an issue pops up. And that's a conversation stopper, excuse me. It's a conversation stopper. Once somebody says, well, that's just your opinion, right? What they're wanting to do is say, what I'm thinking is factual. What you're thinking is just an opinion. I'm here to tell you, yeah, it is an opinion. So is yours. It's all opinion. Okay? It's all opinion because, as Blackburn points out here, the ought that we seek among what is, right, does not just happen and come out. It has to be interpreted out of the material conditions, historical conditions, spiritual conditions of our culture that we find ourselves in, right? And what people in these sides often do is they take the way things are and say that's the way things ought to be. And the easiest way to stop a challenge to the way things are is not necessarily the way things ought to be, is to say, well, that's just your opinion. I'm talking about facts. Facts don't care about your feelings. Okay? But if you actually believe you have valid arguments and strong facts to back up your own viewpoint, then state those as a counter. In other words, if a person wants to say, well, I hear your opinion, and here are the reasons I don't agree with it, and the reasons that I believe this way that I look at it is the right way to look at it, that's different, right? It's not trying to shut the conversation down and win the argument. It's engaging in mutual exploration, right? If, on the other hand, you have no way to counter except to pound the table, dismiss the statement, or bully the person you're speaking with, you're acting in bad faith. This is primarily what happens every time I watch a video of Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder. Is that they're not actually engaging in good faith arguments. They're pounding the table, dismissing the statements, or bullying the other person. Right? And there's lots of people smarter than me who spent hours. Like, you take one 10-minute video by Ben Shapiro, and I've seen logicians and ethicists deconstruct it to show why it's not right. takes a 2-hour video to show why it's not right. Right? It takes a 2-hour video. Why does it take a 2-hour video? Because they just state their opinions as facts and then act like that's the way things are. So you have to go in and you have to take it apart, figure out why the fact's not a fact, right? Or it's not a fact in the sense of a objective fact, right? So you kind of end up in this kind of situation, right? That's acting in bad faith. You're saying, especially Steven Crowder. I've watched Steven Crowder. He's come to UNT a few times, and I've stood and watched him have conversations with people, and they're never in good faith. Sometimes people he talks to are not having conversation with him in good faith either. But often his side of it is not done in good faith. It's not done in good faith because they just want to establish that the people they're talking to are children who don't actually know how to think. But really what they're doing there is sophistry. Right?
They're not truly right on the thing. They are manufactured by all the opposition. They are not really, they're there to track from actual arguments from the right. Because they make
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that's yeah, that's totally right. And their ideas are, and just by you saying that, it just reiterates further, it's bad faith. Good faith is, I'm going to trust that you're actually here to really work this out and think about it, and let's have a real discussion. Bad faith is, my entire reason for being here is to just to own you and show that you're a fool. This is the reason that I don't get into conversations with either of them online or in person if they happen to be where I'm at in person, because I don't want to enter into a bad faith conversation on my part. Right? So this kind of leads us. Yeah.
You think those were in bad faith?
No.
You think those were?
No. I can actually, it's literally about a decade ago that all of these things began to become, because it was the change in social media from I want to find information to I want to be an influencer. And once you got into the influencer thing, it's like, how do I make money off of this? By trolling whoever the hell I can troll, by doing whatever. When you're looking at William F. Buckley and William F. Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal, you're looking at two extremely intelligent people that hated each other, but were willing to have a conversation, which finally ultimately breaks down because their hatred of each other kind of finally falls through. But I do think in the beginning, they really were trying to have a discussion, right? And I can tell you, Tucker Carlson, when he was part of Point Counterpoint, and John Stewart came on Point Counterpoint on CNN, and he sort of owned Carlson and his progressive colleague on the show, saying, why are y'all not actually dealing with the real thing? Why is a comedian the person that people have begun to trust for their news, which should have been a clear signal of where shit was going? Because this was what, 11 years ago, 12 years ago? Why is an entertainer the person people come to for their news, and the news people are just sitting here arguing with each other about shit that's not important? Right? And they were so embarrassed by that, all they could do was basically start ad hominem arguments against Stewart, both of them, the progressive and Carlson. What were you saying, Christian? Oh, okay. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to say here was to point out something that we'll kind of come back to a little more. The issue with relativism when it's taken too far is that it turns into a kind of juvenile nihilism that literally loses all hope and faith in everything. Or it turns into a kind of juvenile skepticism where you're just skeptical of so much stuff, you never can trust anything, right? That should sound kind of familiar. That's kind of, if you really pay attention to all the stuff that's done online nowadays, no matter what the social platform is, there's a lot of nihilism. Nothing matters. Nothing matters. And there's a lot of over-the-top skepticism. I'm skeptical of that, even though there's no good reason to be skeptical. People are just skeptical, right? So what I've done here is I've given you a little sheet that I came up with actually after some of the conversations we had in your class last semester. And that is that in all reality, when you're talking about like, what we did before when we were talking about God, that's really sort of the issue of authority in culture. And today, when we're talking about the challenge of relativism, that's the issue of relativity in culture. And that's because authority rests on tradition, relativity rests on a kind of novelty, right? You don't see that anything's relative until something new comes along that shows you, oh, that's how they do it. Right? So it's about the relationships between things as they come into being versus the relationship of customary behaviors, the ways that we relate through customary behaviors, right? The issue here is that authority and relativity need to be able to interact with each other. They need to be able to flow between each other. Without them, right? Without relativity, authority turns into authoritarianism. And without authority, relativity turns into pure relativism, right? And when that authoritarianism, so then you get into an authoritarianism versus a relativism, I'd say that's kind of where the United States was at from 1945 to 1990, 95. What you get with authoritarianism keeps devolving, it turns into fascism, and relativism, as it keeps devolving, turns into nihilism. Okay? And that's what we want to avoid. You cannot live ethically in a fascist or in a nihilistic culture. Right? Because fascism will bend every ethical precept to serve the fascist ideology, and nihilism will simply disempower anything that would give you any hope so that you can get through it. Right? So if you go into the notes, you can download this. Should I put this on Canvas so it's easier? I don't know how many people. Okay, I'll put it on Canvas so it's a little easier. I'm sorry it's in orange. I don't remember why it ended up in orange, but anyway, but it's got a few pages that come after it that explain why I chose these terms. But we're going to keep coming back to this because I don't want y'all to think because I'm poo-pooing and being like we live in a pluralistic society and we don't need to make laws that are based on the Bible or the Quran. Doesn't mean that I don't believe in authority. I am an authority, so I believe in authority. But I also understand that if authority isn't in a good, healthy relationship with relativity so that it learns new things, it becomes stymied. It becomes very brittle and it just breaks apart. Right? Okay, so y'all have any questions? What? That was an accident that happened when I moved it from one thing to another. I don't even know why it happened. I'll try to change it later before I put it on Canvas so it's not so. Any questions about relativity or relativism? Okay. So our next thing is going to be, I would go through and look at these articles of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. If I were y'all, they're a nice kind of starting place for just basic humanization, like ideas of what people think humanization is. And actually, interestingly enough, if you read them and you read them closely and you read them critically, you'll realize that there are 3 or 4 or 5 articles of the Declaration of Human Rights that the United States falls short of, even though we're signatories of it. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Make sure I'm clear on it.
Yeah.
Good relativism is things like here in the United States we have regular toilets. In some places in the world they throw the bathroom in bowls in the ground. Some
Right.
places in the world,
I think it's funny that you said regular toilets.
They have bidets, they have
Yeah.
Understanding that that's all fine.
That's fine.
is good relativism.
That's good relativism. That's like all these things change.
Like in some places, we have dogs to pet. In some places, they eat dogs. That's still relative, but now you're getting a position where you could look at the dog as and then it goes up.
I mean, what I would say there is you're going to want, if you're going to do that kind of relativism, you want to be consistent. So if you're going to say dogs shouldn't be eaten, you need to really quit eating all animals, because there's really no good argument for why you shouldn't eat a dog outside of the fact we really like dogs. Don't be going and telling people that I'm like, oh, Maggie's all, go eat your dog. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, if you're hungry, I don't really understand why you wouldn't eat a dog. I don't care whether the meat's good or not. It's an issue of, but I'm just saying that, yeah, it's true that there are a lot of people who say that there's no good eating on a dog, but I don't know how you could have whole cultures where they're like, there's some damn good eating on a dog. So that gets us back to relative taste, right? Like in America, we don't eat horse. They eat horse all the time in France, right? There's definitely a lot of good muscle on a horse. If primarily when you eat meat, you're eating it for the protein you get out of it, but where does the flavor come from? Anybody know? This would actually be one of the reasons that most dogs are not. No, it comes from the fat.
Oh, yeah.
The fattier meat is, the better it tastes. Right. And so I think that, you know, when you kind of like take these things into consideration, like why you wouldn't eat a dog, that's very cultural. If you're going to say they shouldn't eat dogs, then you actually should be probably saying maybe we shouldn't be eating meat at all, right? And I'm not a radical animal liberationist or anything. I'll eat meat, especially if I know where the meat came from, like friends that slaughter a cow or have their own chickens or something like that. But yeah, but it's going in a certain direction. It's like, well, I don't know. I'm not too sure about this whole dog thing. It kept going out. And if you got it from dog, right, to babies, to human babies, I think very quickly, hopefully, we'd be like, wait a minute.
And that's what you're talking about with the question.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
want to eat baby? Let them eat baby.
Yeah, and right, and Blackburn also talks about how often there's this sort of like lost in the sauceness of, oh, I think that's relative, that's okay, you know, relativism's okay, that's all right, that's what they do. But then they'll like turn around and they'll get like really angry when they start talking about abortion, or they start talking about you know, social welfare, they start, you know, any of these kind of things that they actually are they care a lot about, and suddenly they're very intensely, oh, it has to be this way, right? So that's one of the other problems with freshman relativism is it's inconsistent. It's either so consistent it makes everything meaningless, that's how you get to nihilism, or it's inconsistent to the point it's irritating, because you can't really get, it's like a minute ago you said it was all relative, now you're saying that it has to be this way. So that's a problem. And the last thing that I'd want to say about the whole relative thing is to remember who here likes to bake? Yeah. So you know you have to use ratios when you're baking, right? So like 5 parts flour to 2 parts sugar to 7 parts water, right? We call this a ratio, right? Well, ratio is also the Latin word for reason. All reasoning is relative. All reasoning is about relationships. It's about finding how things rate to each other, right? So eating dogs versus eating chickens. How does that work, right? Reasoning is ratiocination. It's making things, making ratios. It's seeing how things compare and contrast with each other. That's what we do when we reason, right? And that's also the reason why this notion of the ought versus the is important, because reason shows that there is a huge ratio of is, that is a huge ratio of this is the way things are, to how things ought to be. Does that make sense? Okay, y'all. I didn't pass around the roll sheet today because I need to call it a couple of times so I can kind of get my eyes on y'all's faces. So please excuse me if this takes a minute. There you go. Oh, this is the reason it's orange, is because the original piece looks like that. I couldn't remember. I was like, why is it orange? Okay. Let me stop. Let me